Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the Rustic Vaughan Lodge. So today, we're going to be talking about Edgar Rice Burroughs. Edgar Rice Burroughs, the creator of Tarzan of the Apes, the John Carter of Mars series, the At the Earth's Core series, also known as the Pelluster series. He just did a ton of adventure and science fiction back in the day, starting off in 1912 with A Princess of Mars, the first John Carter novel, followed shortly thereafter by Tarzan of the Apes. So yeah, Edgar Rice Burroughs. I want to talk about him. I've talked about him before. Specifically, I've talked about the Tarzan novels. I've talked about the Mars series by Edgar Rice Burroughs. I'll link those videos down below just in case you're interested. And of course, you don't want to miss any of my amazing videos. So let's start off with Edgar Rice Burroughs by talking a little bit from this book. This book is called Edgar Rice Burroughs, Master of Adventure. This is written by Richard A. Lupoff, and this book is from 1965. This is an old, battered copy I have of it. This was the first copy of this that I bought. Now, this book is not a biography of Edgar Rice Burroughs. This book is about his work. About this delves behind all of his series, Tarzan, John Carter of Mars. All of his work is discussed in this book. It's a fantastic book. It's the best book of its kind that I've ever come across. There's actually not much out there like this about Edgar Rice Burroughs' work. There are a couple biographies of Edgar Rice Burroughs, but this delves deeply into the work itself. And Richard A. Lupoff, he's critical, and he does take Edgar Rice Burroughs seriously. And he should, because Edgar Rice Burroughs, believe it or not, is a pretty important writer. He influenced a ton of authors. I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning of this book because it's interesting. If I can get to the proper page. Here we go. Now, this is written in 1965. At some future date, perhaps 25 years hence, perhaps 2 or 3 times that, descendants of today's community of literary critics will evaluate the American authors of the first half of the 20th century. The vast majority will be long forgotten by then. The remainder will be sorted out in the many years-long process that determines who will survive, who will perish. From the vantage point of 1965, it seems certain that one 20th century American is assured of survival for his historic impact on narrative technique, if for no other reason. Ernest Hemingway. Almost as secure seems William Faulkner, and not too far behind are Scott Fitzgerald and Sinclair Lewis. Beyond these, one can guess John Steinbeck, Theodore Dreiser, Willa Cather. The list might go on. And there is certainly no way of being really sure of who will still be read in the next decade, no less the next century. Authors come and go. Their admirers become more and then less numerous. Eventually, most authors fade from notice, while only the few attain a lasting place in the world of books. Will James Branch Cabal be read in the year 2000? Will James Gould Cousins, will Catherine Ann Porter's Ship of Fools be considered an enduring masterpiece or a flash in the pan? It may seem impudent to suggest the addition to this list of candidates for lasting literary life of an author whose self-appointed task was mere entertainment. But such a man seems these days to be running a strong chance of permanence, Edgar Rice Burroughs. Long popular with the non-classics reading public, Burroughs throughout his lifetime received little critical notice, and that almost unanimously unfavorable. He was regarded as barely literate, pilloried by critics, banned by librarians, proscribed by teachers as totally without merit of any sort, literary, moral, or social. Only in very recent years has a reevaluation begun. It is far from complete, and acceptance of Burroughs by any sort of establishment is still far off. But the condemnation is no longer unanimous, nor in many cases as nearly unconditional as it was for so long. So that was Richard A. Lupoff speculating about the future past the year 2000. And he's wondering if Edgar Rice Burroughs will still be read. He is, actually, but not by as many people as back in these days, that's for sure. Back in the 60s, there was a Burroughs boom. A lot of his work had gone into the public domain, and so all of a sudden, everybody was publishing Burroughs novels. Everybody was, and pretty much everything by Edgar Rice Burroughs was in print. I mean, this guy wrote a lot of books, and you can go into a bookstore, get any one of the Tarzan novels in paperback, any one of the Inner World novels, any of the Martian novels. You can get any of these at any bookstore you walked into. And it was that way for a long time, for 30 years. I caught the tail end of it back in the early 80s when I was reading Edgar Rice Burroughs for the first time. I remember walking into a bookstore and just buying a ton of Edgar Rice Burroughs books, brand new. That was a long time ago. Nowadays, if you walk into a bookstore, if it's a new bookstore, you might find a couple. You might find Tarzan. You'd find Tarzan of the Apes. That is being published by a few reprint houses. Penguin Classics has a copy of Tarzan for sale. They've also got A Princess of Mars. Those are the two books you're likely to find. If you go to used bookstores, you'll find a few here and there. Otherwise, it's dark days for a Burroughs fan. You pretty much have to hunt for them, or you can go on eBay and find what you want. But long gone are the days of my youth when I could just walk into a bookstore and get whatever Edgar Rice Burroughs book I wanted. But Edgar Rice Burroughs, he was enormously popular and important, like I said. Authors from Michael Moorcock, Joe R. Lansdale, a ton of others have been influenced by this guy. And before him, there was Robert E. Howard was influenced by Edgar Rice Burroughs when Edgar Rice Burroughs was still alive. I mean, there are a ton of authors who owe Edgar Rice Burroughs a lot. And he is incredibly readable. You can pick up an Edgar Rice Burroughs book now, and you will be entertained. Certainly, there are things in Edgar Rice Burroughs' novels that might set you back. He was a man of his time, that is for sure. But his books are both fun adventures and also kind of a social time capsule of when they were written. There were some problems even in the 60s that some people had with the Tarzan novels, for example, with the depiction of Native Africans, which went from being not so great to being okay. Even in the 60s, there were some that were troubled by that. And many were tempted to edit some things in the Tarzan novels because of that. Always a bad idea to do that, and certainly now, that stuff is important. It's important that we don't gloss over things, and work from previous generations that have questionable material in it should be preserved just for that very reason. But Edgar Rice Burroughs was more than that, for sure. His work was really, really important. His Martian series, in particular, influenced everything in science fiction for a long time. Star Wars would certainly not be Star Wars without Edgar Rice Burroughs. George Lucas has directly said that he was influenced by Edgar Rice Burroughs, as well as he was influenced by Flash Gordon, which was a John Carter ripoff, a direct John Carter ripoff. Flash Gordon was, in a lot of ways. So, yeah, and a ton of science fiction has taken a lot from those Martian novels, for sure. And Tarzan, he was a huge character for a long time. Not so much nowadays, but really important character in the history of pop culture and literature, frankly. So I read all of these books when I was a young man, teenager, early 20s maybe. Actually, mostly in my teenage years, I read them all. And I've reread some of the major books a few times throughout my life. But I've decided that this is the proper time, now that I'm officially a middle-aged man. I know, it's hard to believe. You look at me and you think, no, this guy's too young. No, I really am a middle-aged man, believe it or not. And I thought it would be fun to go back and read all these again at this point in my life, just to see what I think of them. I've got a ton of Burroughs. I've literally got a copy of pretty much everything he wrote. So I'm going to be rereading all of Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I'll be doing videos on Edgar Rice Burroughs coming up starting next month. Now, normally when I do one of these big projects, I've got the Stephen King project, the Frank Herbert project, I would do it in publication order. But the publication order in Edgar Rice Burroughs is a bit confused because they were published in magazines first and then books, and they were kind of sometimes published in a different order when they were published as books as when they were in magazines. It's a whole thing. So in the beginning, I'm going to be going by the magazine publication order. Later on, it'll be the book publication order. So I'm going to be starting off with The Princess of Mars because that was his first novel, and he wrote that in his late 30s. Edgar Rice Burroughs spent a lot of time not knowing what to do with his life, like a lot of us, actually. And he worked a lot of dead-end jobs, a lot of jobs that just didn't go anywhere. And then he had a job where he was, I don't know if he was editing pulp magazines or doing the advertisements for them, but he was reading some of these pulp magazines and he was thinking, man, I could do a lot better than this. And he could. So he wrote A Princess of Mars and submitted it, and it was fantastic. And he got his whole career. That was, I think he was 37 years old when he started his writing career, which is kind of a surprise because he's a natural. He's a natural storyteller. Edgar Rice Burroughs did some things really well. Writing action, for example, he was brilliant at. He could do it like no one else, writing action. And he was also great, you hear a lot about world building in today's fantasy novels, for example. So you've got these gigantic, fat fantasy novels where there's a lot of world building. Edgar Rice Burroughs was a master of that, and he could do it in a 120-page book. He was great at not having to use a ton of space to create a believable world with governments and animals and monsters and different societies and races. And he went all out in his science fiction novels, which were really influential on fantasy as well as science fiction. And he just had a natural talent for that. And if you read his Mars books, you'll see that. So really good at action, really good at world building, just a natural storyteller. wasn't perfect at everything. He had a tremendous imagination, but it didn't always work for his plots. You'll see some plot ideas recycled over and over again. You'll have the two cities endlessly at war in book after book. You'll recognize a lot of Edgar Rice Burroughs things happening over and over. He relied on coincidence way too much. But you know, the funny thing about Edgar Rice Burroughs is that his books are just so readable that no matter how absurd they might otherwise be, while you're reading them, you believe it, for the most part. And the stuff that you just can't believe, it's easy to push that aside because the rest is just so good. He could, at least while you're reading these books, convince you of the reality of them. So he was a lot of fun in most of his work. So yeah, A Princess of Mars would be what I would start with, and what I'm going to start with. Then I'm going to be going to Tarzan of the Apes, the tremendously influential Tarzan, and then The Return of Tarzan, because those two books are kind of tell one story. At the end of Tarzan of the Apes, you definitely don't want to stop, because it's not exactly a cliffhanger, but it leaves you kind of like, okay, what happens next? And Return of Tarzan, probably my favorite Tarzan novel is Return of Tarzan. Kind of continues and sort of completes Tarzan's story. You get kind of a feeling that Edgar Rice Burroughs had no idea he was going to be bringing Tarzan back after that, but Tarzan was way too popular, so he had to bring him back over and over again. So yeah, Return of Tarzan after that, then it's going to be The Gods of Mars, a sequel to the Mars series. And then it'll be The Son of Tarzan, then The Warlord of Mars. So I'm going to kind of go in that order. And then later on, I'm just going to be going in the order that they were published as books. That probably will be the most simple way for me to do it. I'll probably do, as far as pacing goes, I will probably do maybe 2 a month. I think that's doable because his books tend to be on the shorter side, particularly, for what we're used to nowadays with our big fat fantasy and science fiction books. His books were pretty short in comparison, and they're quick, man. You run right through them. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Because Edgar Rice Burroughs, more people should know about this guy, and more people, I think, should be talking about this guy. So I will be talking about this guy, starting with A Princess of Mars next month. So catch me then when I talk more about Edgar Rice Burroughs. Okay, guys, I'll catch you next time.
Who let these creatures into my yard? I swear, they'll let just anybody into the rustic Von Lodge nowadays.